So welcome to my site, everybody. My name is Paul Smyers. I'm a real estate agent in the beautiful Shenandoah Valley, Virginia. One of my passions and the reasons I got into this business in the first place is low-cost housing, because housing is so basic to all of us, and unfortunately in our country in some ways it's just gotten so crazy. Because think about how you can get a mortgage that your payment is 1/3 of your income, and then you have insurance and other things on top of that, and you end up working for a long, long time, just almost being a slave to the property. And it's very difficult for people who are young. I have children in their 40s. It's very difficult for them to save up enough money to get the credit rating, to get the cash deposit, and so on, and arrange for financing on a property, because the costs go crazy and the interest rates go up and down and the demand goes up and down, and there's a lot of speculation, people buying for over asking, and it gets to be kind of a real problem. So I've done a lot of thinking about this over the years, and that's one of the reasons I am in the real estate business. I was in upstate New York as well. I sold some very simple properties there at one time after 9/11. And let's do a little imaginary thinking here. Let's think about how someone who can go from scratch into some kind of a residence, and it may be a little humorous at first, but there are literally people who are homeless now, and they're living on the streets of a city in some little area, maybe like 6 feet wide of grass, and they put a little tent there, and they call it their space. I've seen that up in Washington, D.C. in the years past. So I have a lot of concern about that. How do we get housing that's reasonably priced so we can live? Now, we have to do our share, because we can't expect that we have all reasonable housing, but we want like 6 bedrooms and 3 baths and a big huge 3-car garage and all that stuff. We have to do our part. I was young, I was small, I had a small place one time. I lived in small rooms I rented in people's houses. I shared houses with other people, friends and so on. And when you get to be married, you can have a partnership, and sometimes you can spread the costs around. You can have a half decent place. But let's do a little imagination here. If you need to have some kind of residence that isn't so-called homeless, but you can put your tent there or whatever rustic thing that you want to build there, and nobody's going to bother you, and the zoning is okay, and you're good with living in a shack, that's fine. You can get a piece of property like that, and it's maybe funny, but people have done it, and it could be done. Now, let me tell you a little story about someone I found on the internet. He happened to be very well established in the construction business. But he told a story online that his father, when he was young in the 70s, they went out and they bought some land. His dad was apparently quite industrious at that time, and they bought a piece of land. And he said the very, very first thing they did was they just put basically a shack, some kind of a 4-sided structure, and they put some big plastic sheeting over it, a tarp on top, and they called it their shed. And get back to sheds in a minute, because you almost need a shed before you need a house. But it was amazing, because they thought, well, this guy years later, he's like well established and he's making a good living and he's doing all kinds of great stuff that he grew up doing, buying property and building homes and so on. So it all starts with something. It's like a seed. When you plant a seed, you don't know what you're going to get by looking at the seed, you see? So it's very important to understand, if you want to address the housing situation, we have to take the approach of, okay, my first place that I live in is not going to be a $600,000 house with 6 bedrooms in a cul-de-sac in Ohio somewhere. It's not going to be there, or near D.C. It may be something very simple, but that doesn't mean it necessarily needs to be an unhappy place to live. I've lived in some very small places in the past when I was much younger, and frankly, I've found memories. I didn't really care. I didn't need to own a big house, because when you have a big house, you have big responsibilities, you have big bills. So I urge people who are getting into the home buying situation, let's say they're in their 30s, 20s, and they're planning a family. They have some time to think about using their own skills, their sweat equity, as they say, to build things, learn some skills, get some tools. It's very easy to get now. Incredible tools available, welders, whatever you want, you can buy it. You can learn some of those skills that will help you save tons and tons of money on your housing. Because, like I said, if your housing expense, if your mortgage is 20, let's say it's 28%, or let's say it's 30% your mortgage payment, then you got some other expenses on top of that. And by the time you get to your personal expenses at the end of the month, you go like, I got like $20 or something, you know. I know some people long ago, they had a house, they paid all their bills and everything, but they had no time, no money to go out and enjoy their marriage, and eventually they parted. But that's the kind of problem that you can get into. It's called cash poor but house rich. You have a great house, it looks all great, maybe you have a nice car in the garage and everything else, looks all nice on paper, but it's a real struggle every single day. So I recommend first-time buyers, especially the younger ones, to think carefully about what they're going to buy and what they're going to bring to the table and how they can maintain their property, and to look for some of these lower end. If you know some skills, there's a lot of things you can do in a house that will make a huge difference without costing a tremendous amount of money. Paint and spackle and things like that. But also you can get your friends involved, maybe repaint the deck, scratch it all down and sand it down, put some new sealant on it, things like that. And I urge people to start thinking on the lower end when they buy a house for the first time. There are banks, they make money by loaning you money. Believe me, they want to loan us money. When you go apply, they really would love to put their name on that and say, yeah, we're going to grant you this $300,000 loan for 30 years, and by the time you pay it off, it's going to be $1 million. So yeah, we'd love to do that. But you think from your side, how can I cut down on the initial cost so that I don't have this overbearing payment that knocks on you every day? I know relatives have done that. I helped a relative buy a house for her daughter, and it came down to a point where, you know, the people who were living there, four children, and they weren't very careful about their cleaning, you might say, so it creates a problem. So when you buy a house, think carefully about how you're going to make it low cost yourself, because the banks, you know, like I said, they would love to sell you a mortgage at the highest possible interest rate that you can afford to pay. And if you put $900 on your sheet, I can afford $900. Believe me, there are some banks that will like, yeah, well, let's make it $899 or $901 or something like that, so it fits right in my budget. But you are not thinking about the other costs. So explore some of my other videos. I talk about the basic super way to get into a property, and I'm going to make another video right after this about a specific kind of a fantasy type of way to get yourself a little homestead. And I'll end this video now. It's been a little bit too long, but watch for part 2, and I'll talk about the actual strategy that if you don't have much money, here's some strategies that you can do to see if you can find yourself a place. So thanks again for listening, and please like and share. I appreciate it.